In the calm early morning light, the 13 British colonies lining the edge of North America looked peaceful, almost loyal. Church bells echoed through sleepy villages, merchants prepared their shops for customers, and farmers stepped into their fields. To any outsider, these colonies appeared firmly anchored within the British Empire, prosperous, expanding, and proud of the red and white flag fluttering above their towns. But beneath that ordinary calm, something was shifting, quietly at first, then rapidly, like tremors building before a massive quake. What Americans would later call a fight for liberty was, in truth, driven by a complicated mix of economic frustrations, imperial mismanagement, rising ambition, political identity, and deep cultural fractures between Britain and its colonists. This story, rarely told in full, is the real reason America rebelled. To understand why rebellion became inevitable, we must travel back to the early 1700s. At this time, Britain wasn't just an empire, it was the world's most powerful trading machine. But the colonies were not passive parts of that machine. Over generations, Americans had developed their own political expectations, economic behavior, and cultural confidence. They governed their own assemblies, elected representatives, managed local taxes, and ran their own militias. For most of the 18th century, London allowed this autonomy because it benefited both sides. The empire grew richer, and the colonies grew faster than any region in the Western world. This system, known as salutary neglect, wasn't official policy, it just happened, a side effect of distance, distraction, and British priorities elsewhere. But this very freedom planted a seed. Colonists were used to thinking, acting, and prospering independently. So when the British government suddenly tightened its grip after 1763, many Americans felt, not imagined, but genuinely felt, that something fundamental was being stolen from them. Their anger wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a reaction to a single tax or a single law. It was the collapse of a decades-long political relationship built on autonomy, mutual benefit, and practical independence. The turning point came after the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. Britain emerged victorious, but the empire's finances collapsed under the cost. The British national debt doubled. London believed the colonies should pay their share of defense and administration. From a British perspective, it made perfect sense. They had defended the colonies from France, secured vast new territories, and invested enormous resources to protect an ever-growing American population. But from the colonists' point of view, this argument ignored something deeper. Americans had fought and died in that war too, and many believed Britain's victory came as much from colonial militias as from imperial troops. More importantly, colonists did not see themselves as ordinary subjects to be taxed without question. They believed in the ancient rights of Englishmen, no taxation without representation, not as a slogan, but as a hard-earned principle dating back centuries. So when Parliament passed its first system of direct revenue measures, like the Sugar Act and Stamp Act, colonists were shocked. Not because of the amount of money involved, but because of the method. Direct taxation without elected representation, trials without juries, enforcement by naval and customs authorities empowered by writs of assistance. To many colonists, this wasn't administration, it was domination. The London government, meanwhile, saw the colonists as stubborn, ungrateful, and dangerously independent. They believed Parliament had full authority over the empire. The idea that millions of colonists could exempt themselves from parliamentary law was, to British elites, a threat to imperial unity. If America resisted taxes, what would stop the Caribbean colonies? India, Canada? Thus the stage was set for a collision, two political worldviews, both rational, both deeply rooted, but completely incompatible. Yet economic pressure and constitutional theory alone do not explain the fire spreading through the colonies. Something else was happening too, a cultural and psychological separation from Britain. By the mid-1700s, a child born in Boston or Virginia felt far more American than English. The frontier-shaped attitudes, self-reliance, suspicion of hierarchy, and disdain for distant authority. Colonial elites, though wealthier and more educated, also carried a chip on their shoulder. British aristocrats looked down on them as provincial. This produced resentment, a feeling that the colony's potential was being capped by an empire that treated them as second class. Newspapers, pamphlets, tavern debates, and religious sermons amplified this identity shift. Colonists increasingly saw themselves as a people with their own destiny, something Britain never fully understood. By the 1760s and 1770s, every imperial attempt to tighten control became fuel for ideological narratives of liberty, natural rights, and self-government. Then came the enforcement problem. Britain had the laws, but not the manpower. Smuggling was rampant. Local juries refused to convict. Merchants ignored customs regulations. British officials wrote letters back to London describing America as nearly ungovernable. In many towns, royal authority existed only on paper. Real power rested with colonial assemblies, town meetings, and informal groups like the Sons of Liberty. Britain responded with force, ships, soldiers, blockades, coercive legislation. But the more Britain tried to impose control, the more Americans believed the empire was becoming tyrannical. The Boston Massacre, Tea Act, and intolerable acts didn't create rebellion on their own. They crystallized it. They made clear that the old relationship was gone. By 1774, a quiet truth took hold. Americans were no longer fighting British policies. They were fighting British authority itself. The revolution wasn't only a reaction to oppression. It was a revolution of expectations. A revolution of identity. A revolution born from decades of self-rule. The colonists weren't fighting to be free. They already believed they were free. They were fighting to prevent that freedom from being taken. And once that idea took root, rebellion became not only possible, but inevitable. The year was 1763. And Britain stood victorious over France in the 7 Years' War. The empire now stretched across continents, its dominion unmatched. London celebrated triumph, but beneath the victory lay the seeds of a future crisis. Britain's war debt was crushing, its treasury empty, and its global responsibilities larger than ever before. The empire needed stability. It needed revenue. And in the eyes of British ministers, the American colonies, wealthy, growing, and relatively untaxed, seemed the logical source of that revenue. What followed, however, was a series of decisions that unintentionally pushed the colonies toward rebellion, not because of the taxes themselves, but because of what those taxes symbolized, a sudden shift from partnership to control. Before 1763, colonial life operated under a unique balance. The colonies were part of the British system, but they were left alone to manage their internal affairs. Governors were appointed by the crown, yes, but colonial assemblies held the real power. They controlled local taxes, militia funding, land distribution, and even the governor's salary. This gave the colonies not only autonomy but confidence, political muscle they had learned to flex. Their assemblies acted like miniature parliaments, and over generations, colonists came to believe this was their right, not a privilege granted by the empire. So when Britain emerged from the war determined to enforce imperial authority with new vigor, colonists didn't experience it as reform, they experienced it as intrusion. The first blow came with the Proclamation Line of 1763, which barred settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. London saw it as a practical solution to prevent costly conflicts with native nations. But colonists, especially land speculators and frontier families, felt betrayed. They had fought alongside British soldiers, spilled blood in the war, and now the reward was being locked out of the very land they believed they had earned. Still, the proclamation alone wasn't enough to spark revolt. It did, however, create suspicion, an early warning that Britain's priorities were diverging from America's ambitions. The real anger erupted with the parliamentary revenue measures. The Sugar Act of 1764 reduced the tax on molasses but enforced it strictly, aiming to cut down on smuggling. Though the duties were not unbearable, the enforcement mechanisms, customs officers, naval patrols, and admiralty courts without juries, felt like an assault on colonial liberties. This wasn't a tax to regulate trade, it was a declaration that Britain could tax the colonies unilaterally. Then, in 1765, came the law that changed everything, the Stamp Act. To British officials, it was reasonable. The tax was small. Colonists paid far less than subjects in Britain. And the revenue would stay in America to fund British troops. But that logic missed the emotional and constitutional truth beating inside the colonies. For Americans, the Stamp Act wasn't a tax, it was a threat to the political identity they'd inherited from English tradition. A threat to the idea that no free people could be taxed without representation. Newspapers ignited in fury. Merchants protested. Lawyers, printers, and ordinary citizens found themselves touched by a tax that influenced every part of daily life: contracts, newspapers, licenses, dice, even playing cards. Benjamin Franklin, testifying before Parliament, warned that Americans would accept trade duties but never internal taxes. London dismissed the warning. Across the colonies, resistance transformed into organized opposition. the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, the first unified political gathering of the colonies. At street level, the Sons of Liberty mobilized crowds, sometimes violently, to intimidate stamp distributors. Effigies burned. Officials resigned. By the time the law was supposed to take effect, not a single stamp agent remained willing to enforce it. Britain, shocked by the ferocity of the response, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But in doing so, Parliament passed another law, the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute authority in all cases whatsoever. This phrase, meant to preserve dignity, deepened the core argument dividing empire and colony. America celebrated the repeal but sensed something darker building beneath it. Parliament was not retreating. It was regrouping. The next attempt came through the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed duties on imported goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, these were external taxes, modeled on trade regulation. But colonists weren't fooled. They understood the purpose, a revenue stream that did not require colonial approval. Worse, the funds would pay royal governors and judges, making them financially independent of colonial assemblies. This stripped away the colony's most powerful check on imperial authority. Resistance grew more organized, and more ideological. Newspapers framed the issue not as economics but as a moral battle between liberty and tyranny. Merchants launched non-importation agreements. Housewives spun homespun cloth in symbolic protest. Even the elite joined in, realizing that if Parliament succeeded here, colonial autonomy would slowly dissolve. Britain responded by sending troops to Boston to maintain order. But this only inflamed tensions, culminating in the Boston Massacre of 1770, when soldiers fired on civilians in a chaotic confrontation, killing 5. The event spread across newspapers in dramatic engravings and emotional narratives. To colonists, it was proof that an occupying army had no place in British America. Under pressure, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but they left one tax in place, the tea duty. It remained not for revenue but for principle. Parliament would not surrender the idea that it had the right to tax. That symbolic insistence became the fuse for the next explosion. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price. Britain saw it as a clever fix for a struggling company. But colonists saw the trap: cheap tea was a bribe to accept Parliament's right to tax. The principle, not the price, sparked outrage. In Boston, protest turned to defiance as men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Britain responded with fury, unleashing the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston's port, rewrote Massachusetts' charter, allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere, and authorized housing British troops in private homes. The message was unmistakable: Britain would rule the colonies by force if necessary. But the British miscalculated. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the crackdown unified the colonies. The other provinces saw Britain's actions as a threat to all of them. If Parliament could dismantle Boston's liberties, then no colony's freedoms were safe. In 1774, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, a body that Britain dismissed as illegal but that the colonies saw as essential. It wasn't yet a call for independence, it was a last, desperate attempt to restore the relationship that once held the empire together. But by then, it was too late. Britain refused to negotiate on constitutional principles. The colonies refused to surrender their political identity. The gulf between them had grown unbridgeable. By early 1775, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was hanging by a single, fraying thread. Both sides believed they were defending principle. Both believed the other was unreasonable. And both were preparing, quietly, reluctantly, but unmistakably, for the possibility that words would soon be replaced by violence. The crisis was no longer about taxes or trade laws. It had become a confrontation about power, identity, and the future of an entire continent. At its heart lay one explosive question: who had the right to govern America? Inside London's halls of power, many leaders still underestimated the colony's resolve. They believed the opposition was the work of a loud minority, radicals in Boston, fiery pamphleteers, smuggling merchants, rebellious assemblies. They viewed the Continental Congress as a temporary union of convenience, one that would collapse once Britain applied firm pressure. To them, the colonies were subjects who had forgotten their place. The empire had offered protection, trade privileges, and global stability. In return, the colonies owed loyalty and obedience. That was the British logic. But in America, a very different logic had taken root. Colonists saw themselves not as rebellious subjects, but as a distinct people with their own political identity, one forged over decades of self-rule. Their assemblies were not provincial councils, they were the centers of legitimate authority. Their rights were not gifts from Parliament, they were inherited from English tradition and confirmed by practice. So when Britain challenged those rights, colonists believed they were resisting oppression, not creating rebellion. This clash of worldviews hardened through 1774 and 1775. Britain's refusal to repeal the coercive acts convinced colonists that negotiation was pointless. The Continental Congress, though still loyal to the Crown in name, began acting like an emerging government. It organized boycotts, coordinated intercolonial communication, and urged local militias to prepare for conflict. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, colonists formed committees of safety, shadow governments that gradually replaced royal authority. In some areas, British-appointed officials found themselves ignored, defied, or forced to resign. The old structure of empire was collapsing from the ground up. Still, not all Americans supported confrontation. Many hoped for compromise. Most feared the consequences of open war with the world's strongest military. Even radical leaders like John Adams and Patrick Henry spoke cautiously, aware that the colonies lacked unity, ammunition, and experience. But every attempt at reconciliation ran up against one undeniable fact: Parliament refused to recognize any political autonomy for the colonies. To accept Parliament's authority in all cases whatsoever would mean surrendering the rights Americans believed were fundamental. Thus, even as moderates pleaded for peace, the colonies quietly prepared for the worst. Meanwhile, Britain prepared too. General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America and the new governor of Massachusetts, watched in growing alarm as the colony drifted beyond his control. Town meetings defied his orders. Militias drilled openly. Colonial stockpiles of gunpowder and weapons grew. Boston simmered with anger, British troops surrounded by a population that saw them as occupiers. Desperate to enforce order, Gage requested reinforcements, warning London that only decisive action could save the empire's authority. British leaders agreed. In early 1775, they instructed Gage to seize colonial military supplies and arrest the ringleaders of the resistance. The goal was not to start a war, but to prevent one. British officials believed that a show of strength would intimidate the colonies into obedience. Instead, it set the continent on fire. The spark came in April 1775, when Gage sent troops to seize ammunition stored in Concord. Colonial spies quickly relayed the plan, and writers, most famously Paul Revere and William Dawes, spread the alarm across the countryside. When the British reached Lexington, they found colonial militiamen waiting. A tense standoff erupted, and a shot, still debated, still mysterious, rang out. The shot heard round the world ended any hope of peaceful reconciliation. From Lexington to Concord, from the North Bridge to the long road back to Boston, British troops faced intense resistance from farmers, tradesmen, and militia companies firing from trees, stone walls, and hidden hillsides. By the end of the day, the British had suffered heavy losses. More importantly, the colonies had shown they were willing and able to fight. The rebellion had become a war. News of the battles electrified the colonies. Thousands of militiamen converged on Boston, surrounding the city and trapping the British inside. The siege of Boston had begun. Across the colonies, royal authority crumbled. Governors fled or were forced from office. Assemblies took control. Towns raised militia units. Newspapers declared that the king had pushed his subjects into resistance. Yet even now, many colonists hoped for reconciliation. They wanted rights, not independence. They believed that King George III would intervene to restrain Parliament and restore harmony. So in mid-1775, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition, a final plea for negotiation, loyalty, and constitutional compromise. But the king rejected it immediately. To George III, the rebellion was no misunderstanding. It was treason. He declared the colonies in open revolt and prepared for massive military retaliation. Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, cutting off American trade and authorizing the seizure of American ships. It was, for all intents and purposes, a declaration of economic war. Across the Atlantic, British reinforcements, soldiers, artillery, and naval power began sailing for America. The empire was preparing to crush rebellion with overwhelming force. This rejection was the moment many colonists realized the truth. The king they had appealed to, the king they believed would defend their rights, had chosen instead to wage war against them. That was a turning point more profound than any tax or law. It destroyed the emotional bond that tied Americans to the monarchy. On June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill further revealed the scale of the conflict ahead. British troops launched repeated assaults on colonial fortifications, winning the ground but suffering devastating casualties. The message was clear: the colonists could stand against the world's strongest army. By late 1775, the revolution was no longer a political crisis, it was a full-scale war for the future of North America. What remained was the final step, the decision to become independent rather than reconciled subjects of the empire. That leap would come in 1776. But the emotional and political shift that made it possible happened in 1775, when colonists realized that compromise was dead. Britain would not restore their liberties. They would have to claim them for themselves. The rebellion was no longer about resisting Parliament. It was about rejecting the empire. By the winter of 1775 to 1776, the war had already begun, but the idea of independence had not yet fully taken hold. Most Americans still hoped for reconciliation, even after Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Their grievances were directed at Parliament, not at the Crown. They believed their rights had been trampled, but they still imagined a future within the British Empire, restored to the political balance that had worked for decades. What they did not yet understand was that events had already pushed them beyond that possibility. The debates that unfolded through late 1775 and early 1776 did something far more radical than merely reject British rule. They reshaped American identity itself. The colonies were not just fighting the empire, they were reimagining what a nation could be. The intellectual shift toward independence began long before the Revolution, but it accelerated dramatically after the outbreak of war. For years, colonists had been reading political philosophy, Locke, Montesquieu, Cato's letters, classical republicanism. Enlightenment ideas seeped into sermons, newspapers, tavern debates, and town meetings. Concepts like natural rights, the social contract, and resistance to tyranny were no longer abstract theories, they were everyday language. Still, in 1775, many colonists clung to the hope that the king would save them from Parliament. That illusion shattered when the Olive Branch Petition was rejected and King George III declared the colonies in rebellion. The emotional blow was enormous. Americans who had believed themselves loyal subjects suddenly found themselves condemned as traitors by the very monarch they believed would defend their liberties. In that moment, many colonists realized something profound: the empire they thought they belonged to did not see them as equal partners, it saw them as possessions. This realization opened the door for radical arguments that previously seemed unthinkable. Just when the colonies were wrestling with this crisis of identity, a new voice entered the debate, a voice that transformed uncertainty into conviction. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared on the streets of Philadelphia. Its title was simple: Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, was unknown. But his message was electric. Paine wrote in a style that ordinary people could understand, clear, emotional, fiery, and brutally direct. His argument was revolutionary in every sense. He declared that monarchy itself was illegitimate, that hereditary rule was an insult to reason, and that the colonies had no future under British governance. He ridiculed the idea that Americans could ever be free inside an empire run by aristocrats and kings. Most importantly, he told the colonies something no other mainstream voice had yet dared to shout: independence is not only necessary, it is inevitable. Paine sold hundreds of thousands of copies in months. His words spread through taverns, farms, cities, and frontier settlements like a spark racing across dry grass. The pamphlet did not create the idea of independence, but it gave it a voice powerful enough to guide the public forward. Still, Paine's influence alone cannot explain the rapid shift in colonial thinking. Events on the ground pushed Americans closer to the precipice. British naval attacks on coastal towns such as Falmouth and Norfolk shocked colonists. In these attacks, entire communities were bombarded and destroyed. Britain claimed the towns were harboring rebels. Americans saw the destruction as a sign that the empire viewed them not as fellow citizens but as enemies to be punished. Meanwhile, the Continental Army, under the newly appointed General George Washington, besieged Boston. Washington understood the stakes. Supplies were short. Ammunition was scarce. Troops were inexperienced. But morale was high, and the desire for dignity was stronger than the fear of defeat. When Henry Knox successfully transported heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga across snowy terrain to Boston, Washington seized the moment. The placement of these cannons on Dorchester Heights forced the British to evacuate the city in March 1776. The liberation of Boston was not merely a military victory, it was a psychological one. It proved that colonial forces could stand against the world's most powerful empire. It gave Americans something priceless: confidence. Across the colonies, another major shift was happening: local governments were breaking away from royal control. Colonial assemblies dissolved or transformed themselves into revolutionary legislatures. People no longer spoke in the language of petitioning the king, but in the language of rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. Still, the movement toward independence was uneven. Loyalists remained strong in certain areas. Merchants feared economic collapse. Many families dreaded the thought of being cut off from Britain. But the momentum was unmistakable. Each passing week brought more Americans to the realization that independence was no longer a radical idea, it was the only logical outcome. Inside the Continental Congress, debates intensified. Delegates such as John Adams, Richard Henry Lee, and Patrick Henry argued that the colonies were already at war and should acknowledge the reality. Others, like John Dickinson, feared the consequences and believed reconciliation might still be possible. But British intransigence, combined with mounting bloodshed, kept shifting opinions. By spring 1776, colony after colony instructed its delegates to support independence. North Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island even declared itself independent before Congress did. The political dominoes were falling. Then, on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a bold resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress debated fiercely. But everyone knew the tide was turning. A committee, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, was appointed to draft a declaration. Jefferson, a young and eloquent writer, penned the document with precision, passion, and philosophical depth. Adams and Franklin revised it, sharpening its impact. The declaration Jefferson wrote was not simply an announcement. It was a statement of human rights grounded in Enlightenment thought, a justification for revolution that reached beyond America, into the universal human struggle for freedom. When Congress took up the document in early July, they debated edits, removed some lines, and argued over specific grievances. But the larger message remained untouched. And then, on July 2, 1776, something extraordinary happened. The Congress voted. The colonies, now states, approved independence. John Adams wrote that July 2nd would be the most memorable day in American history. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The document proclaimed to the world that America was not rebelling for small political advantages. It was rebelling to claim a place among the nations of Earth. The real reason America rebelled was not a single cause. It was a transformation, political, emotional, economic, ideological, built up over decades. It was the realization that the empire no longer protected American rights but threatened them. And once colonists understood that truth, independence ceased to be a dream. It became destiny. On July 4, 1776, as the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, church bells rang across Philadelphia. The document, bold, philosophical, revolutionary, traveled quickly from city to city, read aloud in courthouses, taverns, public squares, and militia encampments. Crowds cheered. Soldiers saluted. In New York, a crowd tore down a statue of King George III. Across the colonies, bonfires lit the night sky. But celebration alone did not guarantee freedom. At the moment of declaring independence, America was not a nation, it was a fragile collection of states facing the largest military power on Earth. The battles that followed would test not only their armies but the very ideals they had embraced. The British Empire did not respond with hesitation. By summer 1776, it prepared the largest expeditionary force it had ever assembled. 40,000 soldiers, British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, artillery, and naval support arrived off the coast of New York. Their mission was clear: crush the rebellion, capture the Continental Army, and restore British authority before the new nation could gain stability. Britain believed the war would be swift. The colonies were disorganized. Their army was undertrained. Their economy was weak. Their government was untested. To British commanders, independence was a foolish gamble that would collapse at the first major blow. General George Washington saw the danger with unsettling clarity. He understood that the Continental Army, not the Congress or the states, was the fragile thread holding the revolution together. If the army fell, the new nation would fall with it. Washington's challenge was not to win traditional battles, it was to survive long enough for the British to tire of the war or for international allies to intervene. Strategy became a matter of endurance: stretch the war, avoid catastrophic defeat, preserve the cause. The British struck first, landing on Staten Island and launching the Battle of Long Island. It was a disaster for Washington. His lines were outflanked. His troops, young and untested, broke under the pressure of disciplined British assaults. But Washington executed one of the most daring escapes in military history, ferrying his army across the East River under the cover of night and fog. It was not a victory, but it preserved the revolution. Over the next months, Washington was driven out of New York, across New Jersey, and toward the Delaware River. Morale collapsed. Desertions increased. Congress fled Philadelphia. Many believed the rebellion was finished. British commanders, confident in victory, quartered their troops for the winter. It was at this darkest hour that Washington struck back. On Christmas night 1776, he led his army through a violent snowstorm across the icy Delaware River. At dawn, they surprised and defeated a Hessian garrison at Trenton. Days later, Washington won another victory at Princeton. These battles were small compared to the massive campaigns to come, but their impact was enormous. They revived the army's spirit. They proved the rebellion could survive. They kept the flame of independence alive. Meanwhile, diplomacy worked quietly behind the scenes. American envoys in Europe, most notably Benjamin Franklin, worked to persuade France that supporting the American cause would weaken Britain, their longtime rival. France was interested but cautious. It needed proof that America could stand on its own. That proof came in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga. British General John Burgoyne led an invasion force south from Canada, intending to cut the colonies in half. But American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded and defeated the British Army. It was a stunning victory, and the turning point of the war. When news reached Europe, France acted decisively. In early 1778, it recognized the United States and entered the war as an ally. Soon after, Spain and the Netherlands also joined the conflict against Britain. Suddenly, the rebellion was no longer a regional uprising. It had become a global war. Britain now had to defend territories across the world: India, the West Indies, Gibraltar, stretching its resources thin. America, with French ships, money, and soldiers, gained the support it desperately needed. Still, the path to victory remained difficult. From 1778 to 1780, the British shifted their focus to the south, believing Loyalist support there would turn the tide. Cities like Savannah and Charleston fell. The Southern campaign grew brutal, marked by guerrilla warfare, massacres, and scorched earth tactics. American fortunes collapsed again. But out of the chaos emerged new leaders: Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan, Francis Marion. Their strategy: avoid large battles, exhaust the British, strike supply lines, mirrored Washington's approach. Gradually, the British found themselves stretched thin in hostile territory. Meanwhile, in the north, the Continental Army endured the harsh winter at Valley Forge. Snow, hunger, disease, and inadequate clothing ravaged the camp. Yet it was here that the army transformed. Under the instruction of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, American troops learned discipline, drill, and modern military tactics. By spring, they emerged stronger, more unified, and more capable. The final act of the war unfolded in Virginia. British General Cornwallis fortified his position at Yorktown, expecting reinforcements by sea. Washington seized the opportunity. In a brilliant coordinated strategy, French naval forces under Admiral de Grasse blocked the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off British escape. Washington and French General Rochambeau marched their combined armies south, trapping Cornwallis. For weeks, artillery pounded British defenses. Trenches crept closer. Night assaults captured key positions. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. When news reached London, the government collapsed. Parliament realized the empire could not win. Negotiations began, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. The rebellion had succeeded, not because the colonies were stronger than the empire, but because their determination, ideology, alliances, and leadership proved too resilient to break. And so, on a continent once ruled by distant kings, a new nation emerged, born in war, shaped by ideas, and driven by the conviction that liberty was worth fighting for. This, in the end, is the real reason America rebelled. Not merely taxes. Not simply laws. But a profound belief that the empire had ceased to protect their rights, and had instead become the greatest threat to them. And once that belief took hold, rebellion was not just justified. It was inevitable.